Dear friends, we are very privileged today. With the global internet, we can find ancient texts from all wisdom traditions worldwide with just a keystroke. Many of them have been translated into a language most of us can understand. There's wisdom available to each of us that is at least the size of the great library of Alexandria. The only problem is that it is buried under a growing mountain of irrelevant and sometimes even misleading information. But if it were not for HPB and her teachers, we would not know where to look. We could not have profited as much from this advantage as we can do now with our knowledge of theosophy. They showed us the universality of wisdom in traditions worldwide and at all times. They showed us their common divine source, the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, which has been working to divulge this wisdom from the awakening of humanity 18 million years ago until the present day with continual cyclic impulses. Until now we have addressed a few traditions before the impulse of 1875, springing from the universal source in the mystical East. First, some Eastern, such as the one from Lao Tzu. Secondly, the Pythagorean tradition, an impulse of wisdom from east to west. And thirdly, the Egyptian, another tradition coming from east to west, but with quite a distinct flavor. In the West, the last two traditions culminated in another big impulse, the most recent from those that we addressed, before the impulse from HPB and her teachers 150 years ago. And that impulse is what we have titled Platonic Theosophy. The importance of the Platonic impulse is shown directly when HPB started the Theosophical impulse in 1875. In her first book, Isis Unveiled, published in 1877, two main causes were mentioned that were leading men astray in the dark age of the 19th century. Dogmatic theology leading men to blind faith and superstition on the one hand, and scientific materialism leading men to the idea of the survival of the fittest and selfish sensualism on the other hand. HPB writes, "It is the Platonic philosophy, the most elaborate compend of the abstruse systems of old India, that can alone afford us this middle ground. Platonic philosophy is theosophy at its essence. Just before the TS was founded in 1875, in 1869, the Platonist Alexander Wilder published the essay New Platonism and Alchemy, including a sketch of the doctrines and principal teachers of the eclectic or Alexandrian school. Alexander Wilder was a great contributor to Isis Unveiled, although he did not wish his name on the book. Blavatsky writes that it was Wilder who wrote the major part of the introduction before the veil of Isis, which was largely based on the aforementioned essay. The first part of Wilder's essay, Eclectic Philosophy, is about a great attempt to bridge religious and philosophical traditions from east to west during the first centuries of our era in Alexandria. He writes about the founder of the Neoplatonic school, Ammonius Saccas. And I quote, "The first proposition set forth by Ammonius was that of a primeval system of theosophy, a system which was essentially alike at first in all countries." End of quote. So we see the universal wisdom religion of all times mentioned here under the name of theosophy, as was first used by Ammonius. It was the aim and purpose of Ammonius Saccas, the Theodidacticos, or God instructed, to reconcile all sects and peoples under his common faith, as Wilder writes. Blavatsky writes, and I quote, "It was Ammonius who first taught that every religion was based on one and the same truth, which is the wisdom found in the books of thought, or Hermes Trismegistus, from which books Pythagoras and Plato had learned all their philosophy. And the doctrines of the former he affirmed to have been identical with the earliest teachings of the Brahmins, now embodied in the oldest Vedas." End of quote. So a clear reference to the one truth, or Theosophia. Alexandria at that time was a great metropolis. Next to the obvious presence of Egyptian philosophy, the Jews were there, the early Christians, the Copts, and also communication with sages from Bactria, now the region of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Upper India existed. Wilder writes that Buddhistic, Vedantic, and Magian systems were expounded along with the philosophies of Greece, but also that the Platonists seem to have been the most numerous and to have held their ground the longest. Ammonius founded the Neoplatonic school of Alexandria, which later became the prototype for the Theosophical Society. It was the school of the Philaletheans, the lovers of the truth. It was a direct attempt by the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion. Ammonius was allowed to, and I quote, "benefit the world by teaching those portions of the secret science that were permitted by its direct guardians to be revealed in those days." End of quote, writes Blavatsky. Ammonius reportedly did not write anything himself. We only have the writings of his pupil Plotinus and of Plotinus' pupil Porphyry. Now, Neoplatonic doctrine was, for a large part, the esoteric doctrine of the Platonic school, the teaching that Plato and the early Pythagoreans taught secretly to their disciples. Now, what were some key ideas of this Platonic theosophy? Let's start to show that Platonism is theosophy at heart. Let's take the three fundamental propositions from the Secret Doctrine as the main example of key theosophical teachings. It is not very hard to trace them in Plato's dialogues. First, the wording of the pro, as we are all familiar with. An omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. Unthinkable and unspeakable. Now, in the description of the One from Plato's dialogue Parmenides, we can find the same adjectives. He writes, if the One is, it is not the many, infinite, without form or shape, that is, boundless, you could say. It is nowhere, cannot be anywhere in anything, omnipresent. It is immovable, neither at rest nor in motion, nor different from itself or another thing, nor the same as itself or another, neither like nor unlike anything. You could say immutable. It has no share of time, nor is in any time. That is eternal. and no name belongs to it, nor is there an account or any knowledge or perception or opinion of it that is unthinkable and unspeakable. Now this is just one of 8 or 9 hypotheses about the one in Parmenides, so it is somewhat hidden, but very clear if you have knowledge of theosophy. But Plato could not be so explicit. To prevent being persecuted for violating the secrecy of mystery teachings and to protect others from misunderstanding. As he himself declares in his letters, and I quote, "For you say that I have not sufficiently demonstrated to you the particulars respecting the nature of the first. I must speak to you therefore in enigmas, that in case the latter should be intercepted either by land or sea, he who reads it may not understand its contents." End of quote. Now the second proposition is about cyclicity. Now this idea can be found all over Plato's dialogues. One quote is, "Everything alive revolves in circles." He writes in Phaedo. And his famous idea that all learning equals recollection, or the teaching of re-embodiment, which is hinted at in quite a few places, are also examples. Another important teaching is the return of the soul to the One. And this is linked to the idea of the monad as a spark of eternity, as described as part of the second fundamental proposition of the Secret Doctrine. And this also relates to the third fundamental proposition of the Secret Doctrine, the fundamental identity of the soul with the Oversoul, and the soul's pilgrimage to evolve towards the level of the Oversoul. Plato speaks about homoiosis theoi, the pursuit to unify ourselves with the divine. And this idea is also reflected when Plato described our composite soul in Phaedrus as a charioteer that holds the reins over 2 winged horses, one beautiful and the other ugly, that must be reigned over, to elevate ourselves to the level of the gods. It was the essence of Socrates' invocation, "Lead me to such a life that the outer man on earth and the inner divine man are one." Now that we have given ample proof that Platonism was Theosophia in essence, let's look at the line of Platonic theosophy up until the impulse of 1875. We will encounter a few messengers, chelas of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, and also other noble men functioning in that line, and we will touch on a few key teachings. To start, we have to make clear that Plato was not the inventor of his teachings. Like all messengers of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, he only passed on what was given to him. And he was himself influenced by Socrates first, Plato being his pupil, but he was also initiated into Egyptian and Pythagorean mysteries. Now Pythagoras was initiated into Orphic mysteries, which originally were of Indian origin, but also into the Egyptian mysteries and Eastern mysteries. Blavatsky writes that in consequence of Pythagoras, and I quote, "Many foreigners were subsequently admitted to share the knowledge of the wise men of the East, who, as a consequence, had many of their secrets divulged. Later still, unable to preserve them in their purity, these mysteries were so mixed up with fictions and fables of the Grecian mythology that truth was wholly distorted." End of quote. Like Pythagoras, Plato tried to purify Greek thought, to rid it of superstition, and to counter the anthropomorphizing of the gods. He tried to show man's divine core, to give birth to man's inner soul, as his teacher Socrates put it. Plato founded his academy in Athens as a new mystery school. And succeeding him, a new succession of teachers started, a new chain of Hermes, until the academy was destroyed in the First Mithridatic War in 88 before Christ. Platonism continued to be taught in Athens during Roman times, but a main impulse was the start of the Neoplatonic school by Ammonius Saccas in Alexandria. Now, if we look at Neoplatonism, it offers some key doctrines from esoteric Platonism or Platonic theosophy. We will mainly base ourselves on the Enneads, the writings of Plotinus, the pupil of Ammonius Saccas. Plotinus presents what is called the three hypostases, from which the whole of nature or all living beings emanate. A trinity that was probably derived from the Egyptians, who had it from the Indians, Blavatsky writes. It is the trinity or triad of firstly the One, also named the First or the Good. Plotinus describes it as a principle beyond all attributes, including being and non-being. It is not a creator, not even a first cause, since activity cannot be ascribed to the unchangeable, immutable One. At the same time, it is the source of everything. This first idea of the One lines up very well with the first fundamental proposition of the secret doctrine. Secondly, the intellectual principle, also called divine intelligence or universal intelligence, in Greek named nous, which is akin to the Buddhi principle. And thirdly, the all soul, world soul, soul of the all, or universal soul. Now we can see some parallels between the three hypostases and, for instance, the triad of Osiris, Isis, Horus, or the Father, the Mother, or feminine Holy Spirit, and the Son, but also with Parabrahman, Brahman, and Brahma, or with the universal principles Atman, Buddhi, and Manas. As the divine intelligence or intellectual principle has the upward act of contemplating the One, but at the same time emanates the All-Soul, so the All-Soul contemplates the divine ideas of the intellectual principle and emanates all the lower realms up to the lowest matter, Plotinus explains. And it means that nothing is separated. Everything is inextricably linked, and in essence is equal to the One. That also means that it is possible to realize oneness or union with the One. Let's see what Plotinus writes about that. Our thinking cannot grasp the One, as long as any other image remains active in the soul. Therefore, you must free your soul from all external matters and turn completely inward, with no inclination towards what lies outside, and rid your thinking of ideal forms, as you did before of sensory objects, and even forget yourself, and thus come into the sight of the One. And another quote: withdraw into yourself and look. And if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful. He cuts away here, he smooths there, he makes this line lighter, the other purer, until a lovely face has grown upon his work. So do you also. Cut away all that is excessive. Straighten all that is crooked. Bring light to all that is overcast. Labor to make all one glow of beauty, and never cease chiseling your statue until there shall shine out on you from it the godlike splendor of virtue, until you shall see the perfect goodness surely established in the stainless shrine. End of quote. Now Plotinus was the successor of Ammoniusacus of the Platonic school of Alexandria. And here another chain of Hermes or Guru Parampara started, of which Porphyry, Iamblichus, Hypatia, Proclus, and Damascius were some notable names. The Neoplatonists reopened Plato's Academy in Athens in the early 5th century of our era, and it functioned until Emperor Justinian closed it in 529 of our era at the request of the last 7 philosophers still functioning there. Damascius was one of these. They found refuge with the Persian Emperor Khosrow. This is an important fact, because the Islamic world began to play a role in the preservation and spread of Platonic theosophy during the dark ages that followed in Western Europe. Now Islam began of course with Muhammad. This was at the time when the Arabs were a rough, undisciplined people with little sense of ethics. The Arab tribes were constantly at war with much violence. Now one of Muhammad's most famous sayings was La ilaha illa la. There is no God but God. And this can be interpreted as a personal God outside of us. On the other hand, it can also be seen as Muhammad's way of connecting to the mindset of that time. Allah can also be interpreted as the divine, the one, the all. The divine that is everywhere and that incorporates all. In the early days, Islam was also supported by philosophical inquiry. They asked questions such as, what about Allah or God? Can a God have characteristics if it is universal at the same time? The Islamic philosopher Avicenna came up with proof of God, but his proof related rather to the universal idea of the divine. Some of his statements that point to this are, the world is infinite, and the necessity of existence in itself. He reasoned that the origin must be something that is not contingent, that does not derive from or depend on something else. If you start talking about it, it is already contingent. It must necessarily be something that is not contingent and that therefore exists in itself. Now this may seem like wordplay, but there's a profound understanding behind it of something that you can also recognize in the formulation of the first fundamental proposition. Everything you say about it diminishes it, limits it, while it is omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable. It can only be expressed in negations. Now Avicenna also taught the doctrine of emanation. The school of Sufism, or esoteric Islam, also clearly taught about the divine in each being. Mansur al-Hallaj, in the 10th century, was still prosecuted for saying, I am the truth, meaning he reached oneness with the divine. The later sage Rumi could repeat a similar statement in later centuries without fear of his life. He wrote, I am the same as he. In the golden age of Islam, between the 8th and 13th centuries, true religion, philosophy, and science were not separate. Many philosophers were involved in both religion and sciences, like mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Baghdad was one of the main centers, next to Andalusian cities like Cordoba and Seville in today's Spain. At the time, the atmosphere was quite tolerant. Philosophy could even contradict the Quran. Unfortunately, this changed in later Islamic times. Although Muhammad himself says in the Quran, there is no compulsion in religion. I've already mentioned that after the closure of Plato's Academy, 7 philosophers, including Damascius, were given shelter at the court of the Persian Emperor Khosrow. This is an important fact, because it allowed the teachings of Plato and the Neoplatonists to enter the Persian and later Islamic world. And this, in turn, had a major impact in awakening Europe from the Dark Ages with the Renaissance. Now, 4 people are initially central to this great movement. First, the Byzantine Gemistos, or Gemistos Platon, as he was named. He was deeply interested in Plato and therefore also adopted the name Plato. At the age of 83, he was allowed to accompany the Byzantine emperor on a visit to Florence. And while there, he gave lectures on Platonism and Zoroastrianism, which were attended by many young Florentines. Now, one of his occasional students was Cosimo de' Medici, a banker's son from the rich and influential Medici family. He was very impressed by Platon's enthusiasm for founding a Platonic academy in Florence. In 1462, Cosimo de' Medici founded the Platonic Academy in Florence and appointed Marsilio Ficino as its head. Ficino was the Medici family doctor and an expert in ancient Greek. Cosimo ensured that all the original works in Greek by Plato and the Neoplatonists became available to Ficino. And these were preserved thanks mainly to the Islamic world. Ficino then translated these works by Plato and the Neoplatonists into Latin. We will now take a closer look at the 4th person central to the impulse of the Renaissance, Pico della Mirandola. Now, from a young age, Pico studied philosophy, but he also immersed himself in Islam and Jewish teachings. In 1484, he met Marsilio Ficino in Florence, who became his teacher. According to HPB, Pico was a chela of the lodge. He was only 24 years old when he published his famous 900 Theses. In doing so, he attempted to bring Islam, Judaism, Christianity, the teachings of Aristotle, and Platonism in line with one another. His main goal was to reconcile the contradictions between the different traditions and to bring a universal truth to light. Several theses actually anticipated the Great Reformation. The Church at that time was not very happy with his thesis, and despite Pico's defense, his theses were rejected and banned. Pico had to flee and died at the age of 31 under suspicious circumstances, probably by poisoning. As an introduction to his 900 Theses, he wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man, which is seen as a kind of Renaissance manifesto. I would like to quote a few sentences from it. You, O Adam, meaning the archetypal man, may, by your own free will, trace for yourself the lineaments of your own nature. You may, as the free and proud shaper of your own being, fashion yourself in the form you may prefer. Remember Plotinus' advice to work on yourself like a sculptor does. It's a clear reference. It will be in your power to descend to the lower, brutish forms of life. You will be able, through your own decision, to rise again to the superior orders whose life is divine. In short, it is our choice, with our faculty of thinking and our free will, to choose to either descend into the material realms or to become divine. This is pure theosophy, if you ask me. Now, with the Renaissance and then the subsequent Reformation, a new wind began to blow through Western Europe. And this was fanned even further in the following centuries. Platonic thought influenced the Enlightenment with its focus on reason and independent search for truth. Platonic idealism inspired philosophers as Erasmus, Spinoza, and later on the German idealists of the 18th and 19th centuries, from Kant to Hegel and Schelling. In the English-speaking world, you had people like Henry Moore, Ralph Cudworth, and especially Thomas Taylor, a century later, who translated all of Plato's and the Neoplatonist work into English. Now, thanks to these translators of Plato, a strong influence of Platonic thought was present in the 19th century in the United States. We already mentioned Alexander Wilder, and the right photo is of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalist philosopher that studied Thomas Taylor's translations of Plato's dialogues in his hometown of Concord, with people like the famous writer and civil rights activist Henry Thoreau. Emerson is known for his essay The Oversoul, a term familiar to us all from the third fundamental proposition. A characteristic sentence from that essay that reflects Platonic theosophical thought, and I quote, "Within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one." End of quote. Now, all these thinkers in the line of Platonic theosophy helped to lay the groundwork for the founding of the Theosophical Society in 1875. In Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky writes the following statement about the period of the first centuries of our era, when Platonic philosophy and Gnostic ideas competed in cities as Alexandria and Ephesus with old Judaic dogmas in early Christianity. And I quote, "Had not the Christians burdened themselves with the revelations of a little nation and accepted the Jehovah of Moses, the Gnostic ideas would never have been termed heresies. Once relieved of their dogmatic exaggerations, the world would have had a religious system based on pure Platonic philosophy, and surely something would then have been gained." End of quote. The impulses have not always been as successful as they could have been, as we will probably agree with Blavatsky. However, I hope I have shown that they have been carried on during the centuries to be followed by another again and again. It could very well be that we, as theosophists, have met before during such a formal theosophical impulse. Who knows? We have worked together in our previous incarnations in Alexandria, around the 3rd century of our era. Now again, we have to compete with superstition and materialism. It is up to us to carry on the work for the success of a major impulse from the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion. Let's make sure that the current theosophical impulse of 150 years will stay at least for another 2000 years of this messianic cycle to become the basis for the universal religion of the future.
Porque na vida a gente quer se conhecer pra